Hello, everybody. Welcome. We're going to give just another quick minute for folks to join, but we are going to try to stay pretty well on track to just because it's a short hour. And so actually with that, I'm just going to start with a little bit of housekeeping. One, just in recognizing that we only have an hour, which is a pretty short amount of time for a very big conversation. This is really just the beginning of the conversation. But if folks would like to just introduce themselves in chat instead of taking time to go round robin this morning, I think that would just be more effective use of our time. And so I'm going to just jump right in. So this is intended to be really a conversation, more of a roundtable conversation. I just wanted to put a little agenda up to help anchor folks. If it stays a small group, we had 22 people register. And so if everyone's on, we may need to really rely on chat. But if it stays a small group, there should be opportunity and time to unmute ourselves and ask questions and have more of a dialogue around this. First and foremost, this is only an hour conversation, and so we won't have time to cover PFAS in depth. This is a huge topic, and I also just want to remind folks that today the conversation is really focused on PFAS and the compost industry, so not necessarily all things PFAS. And so that, of course, the compost industry is impacted by other things, PFAS, but we are going to need to try to keep it a little bit focused for today. I also want to just let people know you should have received an email with a link to a bunch of resources for about PFAS, some more general and some specific for the compost industry. I've, since sending that out, a bunch of people shared very good resources and some really new resources with me. And so I'm updating that list that you'll get as well. So I thought I'd just take a minute to frame the conversation a little bit and share some of what Cav has been internally talking about since the relatively recent article in the Boston Globe came out titled, "When Organic is Toxic, How a Composting Facility Likely Spread Massive Amounts of Forever Chemicals Across One Town in Massachusetts." And this was about mass naturals compost and the issues there. And really, aside from being clickbait, clearly, I think there's all kinds of things that we see as wrong with this, this kind of reporting. So it tells a very small part of the story of what's actually happening. It can also give the impression that PFAS is somehow a byproduct of composting instead of persistent chemicals from the materials that we use as feedstocks or materials in the composting process. It gives some folks sort of a "see, I told you so" point for not supporting diversion of organics from landfills or composting, or even I've heard growing your own food doesn't feel safe anymore, and how that's somehow cleaner, or how food from a grocery store is somehow cleaner or better. I'm not exactly sure where that connection is, but these are the places that people's minds jump to. And it can also be really disheartening. In that original Boston Globe article, there was a quote that said, "You'd think you're doing the right thing, composting and recycling. It's the last thing you'd expect that would be causing cancer." And so, again, it's totally missing the point of it's not composting or recycling that's causing cancer. And it misses the point about what we can each do to try to address the PFAS issue a little bit more broadly. PFAS are ubiquitous. They're used in a wide variety of consumer products. They're in background levels in our soil, in our water, our rainwater, in our bodies even. And focusing on PFAS and compost really gives people, or can give people, a convenient out. It doesn't really push the point of acknowledging that not only are PFAS everywhere, but that we actually need to make some changes to our consumer-based behavior in ways that actually count. At the same time, I think we can all hopefully agree that really contaminated compost shouldn't be spread around. Composters can't pretend that it's not there or that it's not a problem. And it very much in line with CAV's commitment to supporting the production of quality compost and practices that support healthy soil. It really, for me, underscores the need to do whatever we can to maintain clean streams for composting, to keep PFAS out of our compost and out of our soil as much as we can, as much as we in our industry have control over. So today's conversation is we're gonna try to be a little bit more nuanced than some of the conversations running around mainstream media or more mainstream media. So threading the needle somehow between throwing our hands up in the air and just saying PFAS is everywhere, we don't have control over it, it's an upstream issue, and identifying some actions that composters and the state can proactively take now to limit PFAS materials getting into our compost operations as much as possible, advocating for upstream PFAS legislation, and also on the PR side of things, like how do we effectively communicate about PFAS and compost to a broader audience? And so that's sort of my intro to today. Bob Spencer is going to give us a short overview of the situation at Mass Natural. And then Ben Gothier from DEC is going to share an update on the progress ANR has made with their PFAS study and a little bit of information about the timeline that they're looking at. And the intention is that both Bob and Ben will keep their comments relatively brief because this is intended to be roundtable, more discussion and Q&A. So we should have plenty of time for discussion. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and invite Bob to unmute. And I just remind folks that if you do have questions or comments while Bob and Ben or anybody else is speaking, just go ahead and put them in chat and I'll be monitoring that. And we'll have plenty of time to come back around and have those conversations. And just for folks really quickly who have joined, if you would like, feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat box. And so, Bob.
Sure. First of all, I want to thank Natasha for organizing this and actually starting a new CAV monthly conversations program on the fourth Thursdays at noon, right, Natasha?
Yep. Yep, every month.
And except Thanksgiving is on the fourth Thursday.
Okay.
So, but anyway, I have a long history with Mass Natural Fertilizer Company, and as recently as 2 years ago, I was the consultant that helped them get their new Mass DEP permit, which is called an RCC permit. For years, since 1987, when they started the company, before there was really a solid waste program and composting program in Mass, they had a letter, and John Fay just joined me. They had a letter of approval, and every item that Mass Natural processed, they were required to submit chemical testing of the product to the DEP, and then take a test load. And then, of course, on an annual basis, they were to test all their compost products. So every item that came into Mass Natural had letters of approval up until 2 years ago, when the new permit basically listed all the materials that were approved, and they didn't have to go through a case by case. My point is that the Mass DEP was totally involved with the facility. In fact, the section chief for DEP for a period of 6 years lived down the road from Mass Natural, very familiar with the facility. And so I knew back last March, I had a call from the owners, and literally it's a husband and wife in their 50s. And the founder was the father of the husband, Bill Page, and his son, Billy Page Jr. And it just totally devastated them because they were suddenly being accused of all these, polluted wells, 218, etc. So then they started asking me what I knew about it and what if I could help. And I said, I really am not qualified to help you here. And they've been since engaged attorneys, and in Massachusetts, there's a class of consultant called licensed site professionals that are specialists in soil and hazardous waste. So my overall point was that this was totally approved, and I sent links. There's 2 extensive websites, absolutely amazing amount of information. One is the Mass DEP and one's the town of Westminster. All the documents, all the testing, everything's in the public domain now. So I had a call from Biocycles editor Nora Goldstein in May, asking, after they saw the Boston Globe headline, if I'd like to help write a rebuttal. And because there was a lot of inaccuracies in that article. And I called the owners at Mass Natural, and they said their attorneys do not recommend taking on the Boston Globe, in a series of rebuttals or anything. So I have had no involvement, is all I wanted to say, with Mass Natural, other than talking to them and giving them a shoulder to cry on. However, Nora Goldstein, who many of you know, said she had an attorney that she worked with on some other waste and recycling issues out of New Jersey. And if I was interested, she'd set up a call with this person to talk about PFAS. And so I did that. And I asked him, I said, and actually, I meant to say, once the headline hit the Globe, I started getting inquiries here about our compost. And one of them was from a lady who's an attorney who loved our compost and was using it in her gardens. And she was very alarmed, of course. It says, Bob, what's your PFAS levels? I said, we don't test for it. You don't? Well, don't you want to know? So John and me and other staff here said, let's test. At least we'll find out and we can see what. So then I said to the attorney, I said, well, we're planning to test. And he said, I recommend you do not test. He said, I would not test any product until there's a state or regulatory requirement to do so, and a standard and a methodology that's been approved and labs that have been identified. And I said, well, why is that if we're just, and he said, because once we're as a public agency, it goes into the public domain, it could be misconstrued, the data, by others when there's no standard, or they might grab something from Europe that's different. And he just said, hey, I don't recommend you test until you have a standard. And so then he said, do you have liability insurance? Does your solid waste district have pollution liability insurance? And I said, no, I know we don't. And I said, but I'll get a copy of the policy. And like many municipalities, we go through VLCT, the passive program, and our policy has 2 exclusions: pollution liability and asbestos, specific exemptions or exclusions. So not only do we not have it, it's excluded. So then we have asked VLCT, the passive folks, to see if we could buy pollution liability insurance, and they are looking into it.
And that
Yeah.
might
So
be
that's where we're at.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Bob. And I think that's one thing that I've heard a lot of composters, including at the U.S. Composting Council sort of national level, talk about the challenges of testing to know the finished compost, not the feedstocks, when there isn't a context within which to really interpret or understand what the background levels of PFAS may be, or what is, having that guidance. And I think that's a really good segue to get to Ben Gauthier, who's going to share with us a little bit of the work that the state has been doing on PFAS. And I'll just note that Ben did share a link from Sally Brown to that one of the biocycle articles that Bob just referenced. And those are also in that resources sheet that you should have received. But Ben, please.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. Good to be part of this conversation. It's obviously something that's emerging, and there's a lot of complexities and question marks. So it's good to kind of air things out in front of a group of like-minded people. So quick update of what we're trying to do here at the solid waste program. We recognize we're sort of, there's a bunch of unknowns in our organics recycling system currently in this state. We don't know the PFAS impacts and we don't know the microplastics impacts. So we're starting to, we tried to ramp up a group effort with the Agency of Agriculture to try to figure out ways that we could fund a study to try to just get some numbers. Like what is the current state? Is there a reason to be concerned with this stuff? Is it sky high? Is it non-detect? You know, just kind of the baseline, where are we at? As we jumped into that, we realized that it got complicated in a hurry for a lot of reasons. One, the testing is expensive and complicated. Two, there aren't established methods for sampling microplastics or PFAS, and as Bob mentioned, in solid matrices yet. And some of those things will take years to come around to get EPA approved methods or other approved methods. So we batted it around and we're like, does it make sense to wait for a couple of years, 5 years down the road to actually get an idea of what this stuff is? Or is there something we can do in the meantime? We opted to mobilize and try to do something in the meantime, just to put some numbers to it. So we put in an application to EPA for pollution prevention funding. And we just found out this month, or maybe it was late last month, that we were going to be awarded a good chunk of money to do a study. So part of that includes looking at PFAS through depackaging processes and finding out what happens there. But it also funds PFAS and microplastics through the whole organics recycling system in Vermont. So it could be a pretty comprehensive study. A lot of details to be ironed out there, but it's going to be happening. The sampling will, if everything stays on track, will be next summer, and the final report will be 2024 as a timeline. But that's kind of what we're gearing up to do once the money is awarded in October. So that's something to be looking forward to going forward. I guess that's really it in a nutshell. Natasha, I don't want to take too much time talking about that stuff, so we'll just leave it there. Does that sound good?
Yeah, and I think that's fine. We can certainly bring out more points. And I did invite folks when they registered, if they had a question, to submit in advance to do that. And we did get a couple questions, and some are sort of around stuff that you might be able to answer, Ben. So I think we'll just start there, and then folks can chime in. And Tom, I see your hand up. I'll get to you in just one after this first question. So one of the questions that was asked was, do we know what feedstocks are PFAS laden, and will DEC be issuing guidance for changing acceptable materials at compost facilities? And is that going to wait until all the way 2024, or is there something interim in the process that we might be able to expect?
That's a good question. It's kind of a nuanced issue because there are no standing standards of what the impacts and the exposures from compost through grown food to humans or to livestock or to biota. We don't have a Vermont standard for that. Like the VDH doesn't have an established standard for that. So if we see that there's a feedstock, I'll just use recycled paper fiber, for example, that's sky high in PFAS, then that's something that'll be, will require that composters don't accept that stuff. And as it is now, whenever there's a new paper fiber that wants to be composted at a Vermont facility, they have to do routine testing on that stuff anyway. So we should be screening that on the front end before it gets through the compost. Doesn't mean it can't happen. But the problem with PFAS inherently is that it's the consumer often doesn't know if it's present or not, right? It's like the whole paper straw issue, right? We banned plastic straws, disposable straws, and then they used paper straws that were lined with PFAS. And people, so people thought they were doing the right thing and doing the healthy thing, and they're just kind of sucking PFAS through a straw. So it's complex, but absolutely, even in the absence of standards, I think we could reasonably say if something is PFAS has a contamination level of PFAS that's significant enough, then it shouldn't be composted in Vermont.
Okay. And I do see a question coming in on chat, but we're going to go to Tom next. And Tom, feel free to unmute.
It's great. I just Bob mentioned that this is going to be a regular thing, and I too am really psyched about that, and appreciate Cav hosting it and Natasha making space for it. So thank you, and thanks for being here, Ben, to help sort of answer some of those questions. I guess just picking up on the thread already, what might that look like? Like how might DEC, in an absence of data, sort of apply that more broadly? Like how will that how might that list get kind of generated? Like, would it say anything that's fast food packaging that's a paper product not be? We know that it has PFAS in it, regardless of level, since testing isn't super easy to come by right now. Will we just wholesale put a line in the sand and say this is basically considered a liability until we know more?
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of the age-old question, right? Do we want to be go over the top and conservative on the issue and saying this classification of products is known to have potential risk? As we know from numerous studies on food packaging, the grease-proof and non-stick coatings that they use in fast food wrappers. I think even in the Sally Brown article, she linked to a Consumer Reports study where they kind of went over some of that stuff. Some pretty high levels in some of the materials, right? I think that's to be continued, right? We don't know. A couple questions that come up is we don't know how much of that fast food packaging is going through DPAC. I don't have that answer right now. It doesn't seem like it would. You know what I mean? Maybe it is. I don't know. But I don't think that when you get French fries at McDonald's or something, it doesn't strike me as something that ends up going through DPAC. But it could be, if that class of products is that high risk, then I think that's certainly something that we would consider just saying no way until it's dialed in. That goes for a lot of products, right? Could not just fast food packaging, but cosmetics. If there are some cosmetic manufacturing companies in Vermont that have asked Vermont facilities to take the material. And we've approached that we just said that's not a good idea. We don't, even though you do routine testing on it, just the chance of the liability is too significant, too great. It's not a good idea. So yeah, it's a tough situation without standards. It's harder to lean on stuff, but I think we can be reasonable.
Can I just ask one follow-up, Natasha?
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, just on that, I'm asking the question not of just DPAC, but of even composters receiving feedstocks, and
Soil
if nothing
paper.
else, making sure that our list that we put out to our customers and to consumers, or what the state puts out, can include those things that ultimately we don't want in our post-consumer food scraps. And just on the Bob piece, you sort of led answering my question with the question of like, how do we approach this? And I think the most salient thing that Bob said is all of this has been legal all along and been state sanctioned. And the risks of PFAS have been known for decades. And I'm not directing this at you, but just more at the regulatory body in general. I stood in Maine with Mark King and other people from DEC there talking about biosolids in the late 90s or early 2000s and raised concerns about some of these very, very things and was blown off. And so I think the question is like, if DEC is still wondering sort of how to answer that question, I think the whole issue at hand here is the answer to that question. This is not coming out of the blue. And like a lot of these things, really the point is to reorient and take a more precautionary approach that says rule things out until you can rule them in. So when in doubt, I think the answer right now is really simply take it off the list. That's just my 2 cents on it. But I think that hopefully this isn't just another thing to be addressed, but it's actually a sort of an indicator of an attitude that needs to shift around it.
Ben, do you want to respond at all, or you're
No, I think that's fair.
Yeah.
I think that's fair. Yeah. I mean, it's a complicated situation, right? Mm-hmm. And I wasn't around 20 years ago, so I'm here now trying to figure things out. So we're trying to do the best we can. But that's a good point, Tom. I appreciate you bringing up the issue of it's not just necessarily a DPAC problem. These materials going through any compost could be a problem as well. So I think I mentioned it. I don't know if I've mentioned it. I certainly haven't mentioned it in this forum because it's the first time I've been here. But Solid Waste Program is working on pulling together a series of guidance documents for generators, for haulers, for receiving facilities, et cetera, that'll go over, products, source separated organic screening practices, and give people tools that they can hand to their clients, allow those haulers and those facilities something to back them up if they need to do a load audit and there's too much contamination, things like that. So I think that the fast food packaging will certainly show up in that regard, Tom, as something that's like, no, that's a contaminant that needs to be removed. But then you get into the weeds pretty quickly. Where recycled paper products can also have PFAS in them, right? And a lot of Vermont composters take paper, it can be paper towels or other things like that they use in their compost. So where do we draw that line? What's a reasonable place? Maybe that's a place where we can put our heads together and find something, find a good line to draw. But there are a lot of paper products going into Vermont compost now. Do we say no to everything? I don't know.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just getting texts about someone having a hard time joining. So let me just quickly say, Dan, can you send her the link that you have that you use? That would be great. Yeah, the paper towels came up from Kat Buxton saying that, they give school, in school composting programs, they tell schools to compost paper towels. And how do you know, and then they use that compost often to grow food. So like, how do you know which products are good and bad? And there was, there is a database that I can include in the resources package that, or the resources page, a link to it that, that does list sort of red, yellow, green type of coding for foodware, but I don't think it lists like paper towels and napkins, but it does give an indication for consumers, at least about which products are known, which lines, which types of things are known to have, added PFAS in it as opposed to no added PFAS. And so I think that, having some kinds of resources like that, gathering the information that we already know, is helpful in us trying to be as precautionary as possible at the beginning. Another question that we came in was for you, Ben, was, will you be looking for or inviting composting sites to participate in your study? And that was from Emma at Vermont Compost Company.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's still a lot of details of the actual study that need to come together, and that's going to be part of negotiations with a sampling consultant eventually. But our idea initially was to do, we have to work with one Vermont food manufacturer that does packaged food through a DPAC. That's one criteria. So that's one focus of our study, and then the rest of it is going to be focused on just the entire Vermont organics recycling system. So source separated organics would be in focus, compost feedstocks would be in focus, finished compost, digestate from liquid and solid digestates from digesters, and getting some background as well, maybe some non-food co-digester or non-co-digesters, and then background soil stuff too, farms, not farms. I don't know if we'd go to the level of like home garden stuff, because that might be too much noise there, but there's still a lot of details to come together. We're hoping it would be a collaborative effort, but as Bob mentioned, there might be some reservation on the composters or organics managers side. I get that. But if we're all concerned about the impacts to the environment and to public health or to livestock, then I'm hoping we can pull together on it, but more to come, I guess.
Yep. That's great. And we do have a couple other questions, but I do want to just acknowledge that Dr. Raju is from UVM, is participating in the call, and he has to leave early. And he is studying PFAS. He's at UVM, but not necessarily in the compost context. But I thought it might be, Raju, if you have any comments or thoughts or input about testing. I know you have to leave in just 5 or 10 minutes, so feel free to jump in here as well. I just wanted to make some space for you.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Right. Yeah. Good afternoon. So like Natasha like mentioned that I mostly been studying PFAS in soils and water, and also landfill leachate and emissions from the landfills and so on. So we have been uh, developing modified PFAS extraction methods, because there is only like two methods that are out there. One is drinking water method set by EPA, and the other one is ASTM for soils. These are the two methods that we have been frequently using for and modifying them for solids and varieties of solid matrices and so on. So we are looking at various uh, methods to sequester PFAS and then degrade PFAS, evaluating some ideas to at least contain them, like using like cement-based cover materials for landfills and so on. So a variety of things we are doing, and when I got invitation, I spoke with Tom Gilbert about, he contacted me about PFAS and the compost problems with, with PFAS in there as a contaminant. And I find it very fascinating, and it's, for the right reasons, it's a very important problem, and compost being, a key material for soil amendments and agriculture and so on. One thing I kind of agree is that there are, again, now DEC is funding Goodyear for to do this analysis. I think we need to be very careful in using the appropriate extraction methods and looking at different sources. Not all compost has PFAS. There are certain materials that are rich in PFAS, and for example, like Ben mentioned the paper, polished paper, and also the molded fibers. There are some critical materials that has PFAS, and if we can properly characterize source, different components in the inputs, and after and in the finished composite, I think will be very useful. Again, right now there are no standards, so they cannot be regulated, but at least we can take this precautionary approach and or cautious approach in in moving forward. Instead of just banning all compost, we will not use it for soil amendment anymore. I think we need a lot of data, but there's very, very little data that's out there. Maybe one or two studies maybe that have done some characterization of compost, but that's not enough. So I think this is a good study that Ben Goodyear is carrying out, and we need to be very careful in how these things are, how the data is collected and interpreted and used moving forward.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you. And Raju, we had a question. Are you looking at PFAS discharges from depackaging facilities at all? Is that part of your
Not
work?
yet.
Not
I
yet.
would be happy to look at it, but we haven't ventured into that aspect.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great point, Raju. And we've been actually EPA has a study going on right now where they've been looking at the depackaged food waste. So they're going to be looking at PFAS and I think microplastics through that, but they're having the same trouble of coming up with methods. But we've been keeping in touch with Kate Porterfield and Matt Scarborough and Eric Roy as well. So we've been involving them in all the discussions. So I think we got a pretty good team of minds to inform sort of the scope of the study and which methods are acceptable. But there is also another EPA method for non-drinking water matrices coming hopefully soon. I think it's in the multi-lab verification phase now. So hopefully that'll come out at some point and be helpful.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that is one of the things that we're balancing is sort of a lack of data and some like the best methodology isn't necessarily conclusive for PFAS as well as microplastics. And yet we know that they pose health problems, both environmental and human health problems. We know that they're ubiquitous. How do we navigate between what we know now and recognizing that there are some significant gaps, but like on a practical, pragmatic basis in the, on the ground, what can we do between now and then, then being when we have everything that, we could wave our magic wand and know everything that we want to know. And I do, we do have a little bit of time left, and there are some other questions that I'll get to, but I do want to just sort of set that seed of, I'm really hoping to move this conversation at some point today to ideas about what we can concretely do today. Like what can we do in our communities? What can we do in our facilities? What perhaps national or state or local legislation can we advocate for? How can we mobilize? Because what I hear a lot from people in the composting industry, but also buyers of compost and people who want to, do the right thing, it's this total like disempowering feeling when you read a lot of these articles and this information, and people really don't, I just keep feeling like there has to be something between now and when we have all the answers we want to know. And so I would like to put it to this group to come up with some concrete things. But I'll let you think about that a little bit. I have some of my own ideas. And Dan, we'll go to you, and then I'll turn back to some of the questions that have come in the chat.
Thanks. Yeah, I want to echo the excitement around having this monthly venue. So thanks for launching it, and looking forward to future ones as well. In terms of the PFAS thing, I think I'm in agreement with pretty much everything I've heard at this point. And I think I particularly agree with Natasha, your last point about needing to have some kind of plan in place before, 2 years from now, when perhaps we've got a report that says, what is the state of Vermont's PFAS situation? And I would point to Maine and what's going on in the state of Maine as kind of a precautionary tale of what can happen, because rightly so, people are very concerned about this new thing that they're just hearing about for the first time. Most people who are not in the industry and who've been perhaps more aware of it in the last handful of years. And it's, for me, it sounds very similar. It feels very similar to what we experienced in 2012 when we had the persistent herbicide issue at our facility. And again, people hearing about aminopyrrolid, clopyrrolid, and all these scary names in Dow Chemical for the first time were very, very panicky. And we had, pregnant mothers or expecting mothers calling us terrified because they bought our compost and were, wondering if they could eat their tomatoes. And I think what's happening in Maine at the moment is probably pretty similar, because there's a lot more awareness, there's a lot more coverage. Maine is perhaps a little bit further ahead of us in terms of their reaction, and that's based on, those initial results that came up on a handful of farms. And I think there's a lot of reason for concern when there's really high levels of this stuff in certain concentrated areas. But I think what happens if we're not careful is that we get the panic, which leads to irrational, panic without perhaps sufficient information, where people say compost bad, because there's potentially PFAS in that, without understanding that it has been stated that it's kind of everywhere. And so while it's really important to find out, I think, where it is in high concentrations and how to avoid making that worse, I would favor that we start in on the educational component somehow before we have all the information, trying to inform the Vermont populace, hey, this is an issue that we are learning about. We don't have lots of data, we don't have great methodologies yet, but we know it's a concern and we're paying attention to it, and here are all the things we are doing. Meanwhile, here's a bunch of information about how widespread this stuff is, and wearing certain clothing is going to potentially lead to more exposure than just buying an average compost, perhaps. In Maine, they've spent a lot of effort, I believe, and legislation effort on trying to stop these compounds from the source, rather than, they're still certainly focusing on testing all of the points of disposition that they are aware of, but recognizing that that these end recipient users, even the biosolids folks, this stuff they're not responsible for its generation, and so they are like with any contaminant on the microscopic level that ends up in any of our facilities, we end up carrying all of the blame and all the negative attention, whereas really, if we know where this stuff is coming from and putting more focus on controlling that and banning that, has already been attempted in Vermont a couple of times. But I would like to see, I think it would be reasonable to figure out a way, spend a bunch of time in this body and other bodies who know about these things, trying to figure out how to message it to Vermont in a way that does not create the panic, but does educate people on the importance of knowing more about this. And meanwhile, working on legislation trying to limit sources, known sources of this as is happening in Maine. And I think it's just a matter of time when the Maine laws get more press and progress further, that Vermont legislators and others in the Northeast and California and other places will follow suit, likely. But sorry, went on a bit there, but that's where I would hope we could spend some more energy sooner than later.
Yeah, and I think it's broader, and this is where we need to situate, I think, this conversation within the compost industry, within this broader PFAS conversation, and messaging about that, and really sort of bringing it, up a level, and have composters be perceived, hopefully, as active, informed participants in trying to come up with solutions and move forward to continue to support quality compost, as opposed to just, I think the risk we run when we're like, we don't know yet, so we're just going to keep accepting everything, is that then we are seen as, we do bear some responsibility then for that, right? Then do you know if sort of broader, more broadly speaking than just the compost or organic sort of waste piece, is there effort, or are there funds, and either part of the EPA money or otherwise, to really do a good job of a PR sort of messaging campaign?
There's no funds in our P2 directly tied to PR or marketing of any type. But Anne Bijur in our office is working on I don't know if they've actually coined a term for it, but a cleaner compost marketing thing right now. And I think that's supposed to go live at the end of next month or so. I think they're working on some resources now, and then hopefully in conjunction with some of the resources I'm trying to pull together. But I agree with what Dan was saying and what Tom was mentioning earlier, that really just, if we just do a good job of educating the source separated organics piece, a lot of this stuff becomes less urgent. You know what I mean? And so we can probably stave off a lot of that until they turn off the faucet upstream from this stuff being used in products and in manufacturing. But if everyone does a good job of source separating, then nobody loses, right? So I think that's where our focus is going to lie in the meantime, just as a first step while all this other stuff is happening.
Yeah, and I think if I'm remembering correctly, I think that campaign that Anne is working on is focused more around source separation, not necessarily all like the bigger issues like PFAS or microplastic, but just really honing in on those behaviors around maintaining and creating clean streams of organics, as clean as possible, knowing that it's in our rainwater now, right? There are things that we don't have control over, but actually taking control over things that we can. Related to this, I'm going to go to this question next, and then I'll go back through chat for some of the other ones. But Carolyn asks, to Dan's point of addressing the source of the issue, her guess is that Vermont was trying through Act 36 to rule out PFAS in food packaging. I don't know if you, Ben, can speak to that mandate there, and the implementation timeline, and also the loopholes. This is S20, which passed as Act 36.
Yeah, that's a good question. Hey, Caroline. I don't have a whole lot of information on it. I think it was 2023 was the rollout for food packaging, if I remember.
I think so.
and I think it's under Vermont Department of Health's rules. I think they're the ones that were given the authority to implement that. So I honestly have no idea where that is. But I'm going to write a note right now to check in and see who over there is working on it. I know they've been busy with various, COVID and monkeypox stuff. So hopefully it's still on their radar, but I can kick the tires on that certainly.
Yeah, that would be great. And there is Carolyn added a link to that legislation in the chat, and that is also already on our resources list. So Susan Alexander asked if anyone from, I don't think anyone from the Agency of Ag is on this call. If you are, and I'm not recognizing you, jump right in. But the question is, and maybe I'll just ask it more broadly, can anyone speak to what the current practice for compostable solids coming out of ADs is? And I can't. I could certainly look that up and try to do some follow-up and then share it out with this group through the CAV list and website.
Natasha, if I can just add to that,
Sure.
what I understood from a meeting of solid waste folks not too long ago was that once that material that may include packaging, food packaging, gets into an anaerobic digester along with food scraps, it is no longer under the purview of the Agency of Natural Resources, and that the Agency of Agriculture is a partner in this conversation. And at one point I thought I heard, and this is what I'm looking for clarification, is that material would not be allowed to be added to the soil as an interim measure anywhere that it had not already been applied. So if it came out of a digester and went to farmer A and he used it on 6 fields, that was okay to continue using, but it wasn't allowed to be dispersed further and beyond that until this question, which is unwieldy and going to take a long time to figure out, is addressed. So I'm just curious if there is a best practice for that material at this point.
Susan, as far as I know Ag sent out a letter about the practice of depackaged food going to farm digesters. But as far as I know, there are only 3 farms accepting and land applying the digestate from that, the solid digestate from that. I don't know if that's grown now. I can always check, and it might even be less now. There might be 1 less digester taking it. But I don't know that they've, I think they wanted to, I think their concern at the time was that they didn't want to have more farm ADs take depackaged food waste. And that was kind of what they were prohibiting or pushing back against. I don't know so much it was what's coming out, where that has to go or can't go. But I'll look into that for you. And if I can't find the answer, I'll just give you the contact information for the folks over at Ag that are working on it.
Susan,
Thank you.
the only thing I can offer is I spoke to Stephanie and Carrie in the spring, maybe late winter. And at that time, so they have, I guess it's, what is it, or bill, I think it was H41 passed in 2021, gave the agency regulatory oversight of those materials and a broader class of just soil amendments. But they, as far as I understand, they haven't issued anything formally. They've called, at that time, they had called the farmers, shared just their awareness about concerns of those issues, but said they didn't have anything conclusive. And at this point, my understanding is that's the approach they're taking, is to just simply kind of make sure people know that there's a known risk, but they don't have any actual data yet or anything like that to base any actual regulation on.
And Ben, when you find out that information or the context, could you loop me in that as well? And then I can share that when I share the recording of this for anyone else who might want to follow up. Thank you. So we do have 2 other questions. One is if anyone knows if paper companies need to test their products for PFAS or disclose if they're using PFAS. And again, this comes from Kat, who's very concerned about actively promoting schools to compost paper towels or other shredded paper. and she's about to launch a project getting 40 schools to start composting on site. And so her question is, would folks recommend that they just stop and using paper and paper towels and let schools know until we know more, don't compost this stuff as the precautionary step? Or is there some data piece that she can point to? I don't know, folks here now.
Yeah, I don't know if there's a great answer to that. I mean, there might be some paper manufacturing companies that are doing voluntary third party, compliance monitoring for their products. I don't know who they are. And that's the trouble, is most schools that are doing their shopping, they're not vetting their products to that degree. It's usually just what's available through Granger Supply or whatever, they're using for their supplies. And some of the claims might not be backed up 100%. So there's a lot of variability. And if they really want to do their homework, then it may be safe to vet out a product that they can use. And the school is kind of a nice capsule to do that, because they're purchasing all their products. It's not coming in from elsewhere. They have control over what's coming in. So they might be able to succeed in that instance with a little bit of homework and maybe ongoing, just checking the products over time, continue to comply. But outside that, it's kind of Wild West. I mean, you could buy something today that they've changed the manufacturing or the sourcing of stuff tomorrow, and it's a different product next week. So I always say, if you're concerned about it, it's best to design your composting system to not use the stuff at this time.
Yep. And just before we go to Tom, I'll just share that it's that database that I referenced. I'll double check to see if they do include things like napkins and paper towels, but it's maintained by the Center for Environmental Health. And I'll add a link to that database on the updated resources that I share around after this call. Tom.
Yeah, I guess, you were sort of trying to point us towards like, okay, what are actionable things? And that's question sort of, reflects a lot of the conversation that has been happening about it's just, there's so much out there. It's so hard to tell. And I guess one suggestion that I have is, and I think this is where like ANR, even Ag and CAV could be partnering right now, is just something you and I have talked about over the years, Natasha, of really coming up with a database of these disposable products and doing the going through the grind of getting in touch with distributors to have them press on their manufacturers. We should be able to get material safety data sheets on most of these products. It's labor intensive. But I think if for instance, if ANR sent out a letter to all of the distributors in the state, which there are not many, saying, we're trying to get our arms around this, expect a call from CAV or whatever, maybe it's internal to ANR. And we basically are expecting you to voluntarily participate. I think if we kind of like round up all of the players, create some state leadership around the issue that says, in an absence of clear data, we need collaboration, and fund it to do the hard work to really create a comprehensive list. I think that then gives us a lot of power as individual operators, and it allows ANR to put out lists to homeowners to say, hey, if you're trying to reduce your potential PFAS contributions, here's how you can do it. Don't put your dryer lint in the compost bucket. Basically, like, there's a lot of these things that I think we could do relatively easily that may not be perfect, but if we can like at least get the most offensive things clarified and make that the outreach that Dan's talking about, I think it deserves a memorandum from ANR to the public to say, hey, wastewater is probably one of the most egregious places that PFAS are showing up. Consider not buying stuff that's covered in PFAS that's going to go through your washing machine. I think that's the type of thing that we can be doing right now that's collaborative, does the public messaging that Dan is describing, and gives us, of all people, CAT's definitely trying to get good source separation happening, and how horrible would that be if inadvertently, they're including PFAS in the school compost, Same way about, so we have a couple of our own rules of thumb. Mostly it's just to be super conservative and say no to virtually everything. That's not just straight food. We don't, for instance, take floral products. because of all of the studies that show how fungicides in Central and South America and in Israel come in on those floral products to the US. Well, they're persistent. I don't want them in my compost. But that's just us geeking out and better understanding things through searching academic databases ourselves. It'd be really nice to have that state level support right now, kind of leaning in and trying to, imperfect as it may be, just keep uncovering this. And I think this is a place where we can collaborate, and I think we need to bring in those other entities that have a major role, that have more buying power than any of us individually in the game, to then help us do that heavy lift.
Any thoughts from anyone on that? I think Cav would be happy to play a role if we could find some funding. I'll just say up front, we don't have a lot of spare change at the moment for unfunded projects that are time consuming. I don't know if that's something that the state would have, or if there are plans to do something similar, or ability to do something similar just with an A&R on your own. I don't know, Ben, if you're
I mean, we didn't have any current plans to do something like that. That seems like a massive undertaking, so it wasn't something that was on our radar. But I can see the value in that to all on site and Vermont composters, certainly.
Yep. The other thing, and we just have a few minutes left. The other thing that I would, oh wait, so sorry, let me just go back to chat. Ellie is saying a worthwhile suggestion to consider, Tom. She would point anyone who would be considering this project to work that is going on in California right now, specifically in San Mateo County, and she provides a link to that. And so we could certainly, I'll include that link in the resources file. I'll go make sure I go through and include everything that's been shared in chat when I update that file, which is around waste reduction and foodware. And then Carolyn asks, could the ANR VAAFM study include actionable recommendations like the one Tom is suggesting? So even if it's not getting it all done in-house, like a list of really concrete things, or maybe that's also part of the plan, or already part of the plan, I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's part of what we need to provide legislature is the study and a bunch of items in the report that include just some information to base some decisions off of. So that would certainly be part of it.
Yeah, great. And then the last thing that I want to just bring in here, Cav is a member of the U.S. Composting Council, and through them, I've been trying to figure out how to potentially share out within Vermont, or if there's interest about national level legislation that we can individually take action on or get behind in terms of really, going upstream in terms of some potential federal legislation. And if there's interest and appetite for that within CAV's community, I can work on a system to be getting some of, filtering some of those specific things out to the community. There are, of course, also state level activities, including the DPAC. This issue is broader than DPAC, as we clarified earlier, but there is a DPACager stakeholder group that is, their first meeting is the 31st of this month, so next week. And while the stakeholders are clearly identified, it is open to the public and virtual as well as in-person participation is available. So anyway, there are things, I guess I would also just not, I think one of the things that we can each do is stay aware of, and CAV could potentially try to help act as a little bit of a clearinghouse, which I've been doing some of through the Farm to Plate policy group as well, in terms of state as well as national legislation that we could lend our voices to and also learn from, and potentially adopt some, even if it may not pass at the national level, thinking about what we might want to pick and bring into the state level in the interim. Dan shared that Maine DEP's effort to identify all the incoming pathways of products that contain PFAS. There's a link to that. And so that might also be a good place to start in terms of thinking about, identifying those more offending products, as we've been calling them here. We're really right at the hour and people are starting to have to drop off. Any final closing comments anyone wants to make? This is, an hour is not a lot of time, but I'm glad that we made the time to meet. And I think that this is hopefully the beginning of some really good collaborative work that can come from this, where we can find common ground and pull together as opposed to sort of, being the opposing. And I think one takeaway message that we can see in Maine and certainly in Massachusetts is the need for real partnership, I think, between state and individual facilities. There are a lot of examples out there of how things haven't been quite right, where people are, sort of maybe a little too quick to point fingers, or, really sort of trying to pass the hot potato of no one wants to be tagged as responsible for the PFAS. But I think we have a real opportunity in the state of Vermont to not only learn from what is going on in states around us, but also to be a leader and really find a solid path forward. And so I'm just going to leave you with hopefully that as a little bit of inspiration for your days moving forward. And thank you so much for joining us. This is recorded. I will be sharing it out as well as updated resources. If anyone thinks of other resources they'd like to add, please send them my way. It can be I'll add it on the CAV website as well. And so it can be sort of a living document because we're learning new stuff every day. So thank you all. And with that, I will just close the meeting.